The Development Coordination Authority's focus will be on establishing those additional approvals at the upfront sort of project approval stage. But what they do is relate to the issuing of licenses and conditions and other things that relate to the operation of the project. So it doesn't take away from the need to be able to manage the environmental or sustainability impacts of a project throughout its entire life cycle. But what it might mean is that you have more certainty around what some of those parameters would be at an earlier stage.
Welcome to The Greener Way. I'm your host, Michelle Baltazar, Executive Director of Media at FS Sustainability. We are recording on Gadigal land and we pay our respects to the traditional custodians of country and elders, past and present. In today's episode, we will explore the proposed reforms to the State of New South Wales planning framework for housing in particular, and we will talk about what they are and what they mean, specifically for those who work in either the sustainability or investment sector. Joining us to shed her insights on this is Jane Gibbs, National ESG Advisory Lead at Unwelt. Jane, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Michelle. It's great to be here.
By way of background, Jane has more than 2 decades of experience in this sector. She started her career as an environmental scientist and has established her expertise working at the New South Wales Treasury, the New South Wales Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water, and also at the Department of Land and Water Conservation. But today, she's wearing the hat of being at Unwelt. So first of all, Jane, for those who are not familiar with Unwelt, tell us a little bit more about the business.
Thanks, Michelle. So Unwelt is an Australian-owned environmental and social consultancy. We specialise in providing quality outcomes for clients through seeking better community and environmental outcomes, and we do that through our thorough understanding of government requirements to enable timely approvals for more efficient project delivery.
So I guess the reason why I thought, I should reach out to you is that I did see you do a paper around this proposed legislation. Not a lot of people know this, but it was only on the 17th of September this year that the New South Wales Minister for Planning and Public Spaces, the Honourable Paul Scully, tabled the Environmental Planning and Assessment Amendment Planning System Reforms Bill. So because we are on podcast, we will just call it EPNA maybe for
Yes.
for our purposes. But tell us, what is it about and why should the corporate sector and the investment community care?
That's a very good question, Michelle. So this is an amendment that's proposed to the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, which has been around since 1979. And I checked, and this is actually the 17th amendment that the New South Wales government has introduced in this term, so since March 2023. So there is a lot of interest in reform in the planning system, and for corporate and investment audiences, it's really imperative to understand what some of those changes might mean. So there's a big focus on modernising the system to streamline processes through developing targeted development assessment pathways and looking at more proportionate level assessment to focus on those material issues that need to be considered from an environmental and community perspective. One of the other key things is to introduce objects of the Act around climate resilience, which is really significant, and I'd be happy to talk about that a bit further later on if you wish.
Definitely. Well, that is the phrase that kind of stuck out to me when I was reading your piece, is that it's about climate resilience. But for the most part, you did call this one of the, despite it being the 17th now, this is one of the most significant overhaul of the Act. So what were your key findings? And maybe we can elaborate around the introducing a new object to promote resilience to climate change and natural disasters.
Yes, certainly. So this is a really significant reform piece. So the planning legislation has been in place since 1979, and there's been a lot of tinkering around the edges, but there's only been a few examples where there's been such whole-scale reform as is proposed now. One of the key things, noticing your focus on housing, is the establishment and formalisation of some administrative arrangements around a housing delivery authority. And the other fairly major change is the establishment of a development coordination authority, which will allow for a much better integration of those environmental issues where other government agencies need to get involved in issuing approvals as part of the planning process. there's quite a lot of change, but I think what we'll end up seeing is some of the devil is in the detail. So the legislation hasn't been passed by both houses of the New South Wales Parliament yet. It has passed through the Legislative Council, which is effectively the lower house, but it is still subject to some changes potentially through the upper house and still needs, of course, to be endorsed through the upper house before it can become part of the legislative framework in New South Wales as well.
But in terms of the timeline, you believe that there could be some changes from the first quarter of 2026, or has that changed?
No, I'd be very surprised if the legislation isn't through and operational in the early part of 2026. So the legislation still needs to be passed. There are still some regulations and other environmental planning instruments that may need to be amended to give effect to some of the changes. But in fact, what we're seeing is that this legislation is allowing for the formalisation of some already informal arrangements that are already operating within the New South Wales government.
Can you give a couple of examples? I know that we haven't talked about housing supply, but housing is a national issue, more so in New South Wales. But we're not just talking about housing supply reforms for affordable housing, but across all forms of housing.
That's right. So the New South Wales government has had a really big focus on housing delivery, as has the Australian government. So we've seen the transport-orientated reforms, which were introduced last year and was one of those 17 amendments that I mentioned earlier. We've also seen the establishment of the Housing Delivery Authority, which is already operating in way of receiving expressions of interest for certain types of development. We've seen the streamlining of some pathways to facilitate increased housing development as being able to be designated as state significant development over time, which means that it can be assessed at the state level and really changes sort of the relationship that some developments may have with local government.
Now, you've said it. It's about improving efficiency and having a new pathway. I believe one of the central feature of the reforms is this creation of a development coordination authority led by the planning secretary. This one-stop shop model, if you like, that you've mentioned in your paper, will that reduce costs for a lot of sustainability profession, or what does this mean exactly?
A lot of focus is getting the project approval up front, but often that's not the end of the story. So at the moment, people would need to often seek other approvals, either for water, for pollution, for bushfire, for roads and traffic related issues. And the idea is that all of those separate government agencies, which would normally give an approval over an extended period of time, will be represented within this Development Coordination Authority and be asked to streamline their requirements up front to minimise surprises for developers down the track. So it really is about providing certainty for the development industry through a better coordination attempt up front and through clearly having the planning secretary as the decision maker in relation to some of those other issues.
And I know that this would be such a relief for a lot of the parties concerned, where instead of talking to several approval bodies on biodiversity, bushfire, water, transport, pollution, as you rightly pointed out, that it would all be consolidated, if you like. But it seems to me that this would take a long time. I mean, this is unraveling a system that's existed for decades. What would be a reasonable expectation for a sustainability expert in terms of, do we plan for this over a 2 to 3 year transition pathway, or will this take longer, assuming there would be some changes from the first quarter of 2026?
That's a really good question, Michelle. And I think timeliness has always been an enemy of the planning system, especially when we have a complex system like we do in New South Wales. In terms of impacts for sustainability professionals and timeliness, the project approval is only one part of a project life cycle, and sustainability professionals would be aware that it really is imperative to be looking at sustainability credentials of a project at all stages, at the pre-feasibility, feasibility, project approval, and the operational stages, as well as closure stages of a development. The Development Coordination Authority's focus will be on establishing those additional approvals at the upfront sort of project approval stage. But what they do is relate to the issuing of licenses and conditions and other things that relate to the operation of the project. So it doesn't take away from the need to be able to manage the environmental or sustainability impacts of a project throughout its entire life cycle. But what it might mean is that you have more certainty around what some of those parameters would be at an earlier stage in your development. So you have more certainty about whether you're able to proceed down a particular pathway or not.
So if I understand this correctly, this better articulates all of the concerns that in the past were, gray areas or maybe subject to several approval bodies. This will now all be clear. It's not prettier, but it's cleaner to look at the documentation early on.
I think that's a good way to describe it. It's definitely not prettier. And I guess what it does is internalise potentially some of those disputes between agencies where developments have legitimately not been able to proceed because they've not been able to achieve that sort of final licensing requirement or certification that is needed before their project can commence. So it really is trying to bring more of that to an upfront stage and also perhaps facilitate those discussions with those experts at an earlier stage in the development so that expectations are understood at it as early as possible so that those can be planned for and managed.
And finally, my second last question, I want to circle back to climate change and natural disasters. I can't help but see it as front of mind that the flooding in Lismore, for example, changed the dynamics, the values of property, planning, and all sorts of expectations around where people live. Then we have bushfire, which is a seasonal but constant risk as well. For our listeners who are super funds, fund managers, or financial advisors wanting certainty around infrastructure that they probably part invest in or maybe impacts their members or investors, what would be the kind of future or longer term impact of all these significant reforms?
In relation to super funds and investors, understanding physical climate risk is a really material issue. We've seen it, especially for the insurance industry, be a very expensive cost, and Australia is well known globally as having high exposure to extreme climate events, both now through natural climate variability, but also as an ongoing issue in relation to future potential climate change impacts. So Lismore is a very good example. I did quite a lot of work after the Lismore floods, looking at some of the planning issues and I guess some of the climate resilience provisions that are now included in the Act means that there will need to be consideration about where developments can be sited safely to avoid managing some of the impacts that we've seen unfold both with bushfires, with flooding, also with coastal development, where development has been poorly sited, climate impacts have not been sufficiently considered, and we basically have communities stuck in it with legacy sort of housing developments that are really not going to be in resilient sort of locations going forwards. So Lismore has prompted an extreme sort of response around that. There's a number of buybacks that are proposed, and we've also seen that happen in Queensland as well. For investors, it really is a matter of buyer beware in terms of what you're investing in. The need to incorporate climate change parameters in infrastructure planning and also other types of development is fairly well understood at this stage that we're in. And I think especially now in the lead up to the Climate Change Conference of the Parties, which will be held in Brazil in the next few weeks, we will start to see much more discussion in the short term around climate change impacts and really needing to understand what some of those in the long term as well. The climate change scenarios are not going to, climate change is not going away. The scenarios are not going to be looking any brighter in the future. And it really is imperative on all of us through all stages of projects to look at both our own environmental footprint, but also the types of things that we're investing in and making sure that they are responsible investments at the end of the day.
Well said. I almost feel like you've answered my next question, but finally, anything else you'd like to share with our listeners?
Thank you, Michelle, for the opportunity. So I think the planning reforms represent a really important opportunity to really look at how we are doing development assessment and what those opportunities might be. Given the number of reforms we've had, I'm sure this is not the end of the road for further reform to the planning system. So the engagement with environment and community outcomes is really important. I didn't mention earlier, I think engagement of the community at an early stage in any development assessment and planning is really important, both to understand the impacts, but also to manage some of those climate issues and expectations as well. And we're in the process of helping our clients deal with some of those issues. And we really look forward to seeing where these reforms land and being able to navigate them in the most responsible way possible.
Well said. I'm definitely going to put it in my calendar to see where we're at from March next year. For those who want to know more about the insights paper that you wrote, we will share the link with our listeners in our show notes. But once again, Jane, thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much, Michelle. Have a great day.
Thank you. This is The Greener Way. I'm Michelle Baltazar. Thank you for listening.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement, and if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.